Setting Sustainability Standards for Wildlife Tourism in Southern Africa, a Harvard Extension Sustainability Initiative for Destination Management in the Southern African Development Community. The SADC is extremely arid. This is a very, very broad biome map. There are much more detailed ones, but just in general, it's largely an arid region dominated by the Kalahari Desert. There are 108 languages spoken there, and I would argue that there are 108 cultures there, since language is often a proxy for culture. South Africa, I always remind people that, remember, it was South Africa where they performed the first human heart transplant, Dr. Christian Barnard, and it wasn't done in a thatched hut. And so they look at it in more detail. And so really to look at the overall sustainability of destination management of a region, you have to look at the environmental, the cultural, the socioeconomic, and the human footprint, which is in part tourism. I looked at 8 destinations in 4 countries, 5 of which I spent some time at, not during the semester. Wildlife tourism in Southern Africa has a variety of destinations, everything from hunting camps to luxury lodges, such as that one by Karen Downey, Kruger National Park, the primary wildlife tourism destination, and the Daikare Bushman Preserve in Botswana are just some examples. The evolution of wildlife tourism in Africa really began with the elephant hunters like Frederick Courtney Selous, who inspired and then the later professional hunters like Donald Kerr and Sid Downey. When Kenya banned hunting in 1967, they started guiding photographers instead of hunters, and a lot of the professional hunters moved south to the SADC. But at any rate, so photographic safaris are a large part of wildlife tourism in Africa, but they're not the only part of wildlife tourism in Africa. And so if you follow the other thread of wildlife tourism in Africa, also began with the elephant hunters, our own Teddy Roosevelt, Ernest Hemingway, Robert Rourke, Nelson Mandela, and King Juan Carlos of Spain just this past year in hunting elephants in Botswana. And this sometimes upsets people quite a bit, particularly those of us in America, because we're used to a different model. We're used to the model that really started with Yellowstone National Park, where protection combines tourism with wildlife protection. It's primarily done in state or national parks, and wildlife is legally classified as res nullius, belonging to no one, but the state has de facto ownership. In Southern Africa, there's a different model that's been emerging over the past few decades, where wildlife tourism is conducted now on public, private, and community land. It combines tourism with protection also, but it's both consumptive and non-consumptive. And hunting tourism is a major part of wildlife tourism in Southern Africa. Wildlife is still res nullius, but in 3 of the 4 countries I studied, it belongs to whoever takes possession of it, which I'm sure sounds rather strange, but that goes back to the corpus juris civilis of the Emperor Justinian. And that derives from the idea that if there's a fish in the river, it belongs to no one. But if you catch it on a hook, then you've taken possession of it. It belongs to you. So they sort of adopted that law. But let's take a look at Namibia. One of the reasons that there's a place for hunting tourism is that a lot of Southern Africa, and this is a photograph of the high central plateau in Namibia I took about 10 years ago. And it doesn't have anything, number 1, to make a living on, number 2, to attract tourists. It's just there. If you're going to try to raise crops, you'll raise them right here. But that happens to be a feeding station for that small herd of blesbok right in the middle of that. And so if you remove those little pans, what they call pans, those feeding stations, you can extirpate an entire species in a region just by removing the pans, by trying to grow crops. Yeah?
Just clarification, feeding station, is it?
That's my term. There's a river running across here. There's riverine growth here. There's dry burnt grasses and there's bushes. Blessbach don't eat any of that. They want the moist grasses. There's only moist grasses down here. So they'll feed here, then they'll wander across looking for some other moist grasses to feed on. So if you take out these little pans, you might think you're just eliminating something that's insignificant. But these animals depend upon these pans as they migrate across the Kalahari. In 1967, the government of Namibia said, we're going to adopt this, we're going to devolve ownership of wildlife into the hands of the ranch owners, the white ranch owners. It wasn't until 1995 that the indigenous peoples were also granted ownership of wildlife. And they developed what are called communal conservancies. And so all of a sudden, the only resource that was available to them, really, they were living a subsistence lifestyle. Wildlife they now owned, and they could profit from it. These are three of the Namibian conservancies, Kasika, Nainai, and Salambala. Kasika has more aesthetically appealing terrain, more wildlife. They can attract photo tourists. What's that, about 85% of their tourists are photo tourists, joint venture tourists they call it. Nainai is about 50% trophy hunting tourists, and Salambala is about almost 70% trophy hunting tourists. So by devolving ownership of resources into the hands of the local people, they can manage the tourism based upon what the land offers. If there's enough wildlife and beautiful scenery, they can attract photo tourists. If there's a lot of wildlife, but it's hard to find, and you have to go out and hunt it, and it's arid and not very interesting, you can bring in the trophy hunters. Yeah.
Just the bar charts, could you just put, that's how much each of those conservancies is earning?
Right. So you can see in Kasika, between 2004 and 2006, they went from zero income to over $1 million Namibian. That's a lot of money all at once to a rural village of indigenous people living a...
When did that happen? I mean...
Somebody probably opened up a safari lodge, a photo safari lodge. Mm-hmm. A joint venture company came in. Mm-hmm. Extraordinary amount of money. So the benefits through 2007 to the Namibian communal conservancies of indigenous peoples living on marginal land in rural Namibia with very little resources went from zero in 1994 to $40 million Namibian dollars. Now, I think the conversion rate is based on the South African rand. It's probably 6 or 7 to 1. See, that's still something like $6 or $7 million. Projected through 2030, $1 billion, almost $1,000 million to the community-based natural resource management communal conservancies in rural Namibia. Chris Weaver, director of WWF Namibia, said, as soon as you create a conservancy, all you need is a tent and a jeep and you can start to make money. And he said, poaching stops almost overnight because the people realize there's value in protecting the wildlife, whether it's for photographers or hunters. And so the wildlife came back too. These are just springbuck and zebra. Springbuck went from virtually zero in 1982 to over 90,000 by 2002. South Africa. What happened in South Africa was that aside from Greater Kruger, there was a revolution in game ranching in South Africa. And now 17 to 18% of South Africa's entire landmass, an area equivalent to the entire United States National Park System, has been converted from commodity crop farms or cattle or sheep ranches into game ranches. That also offered additional habitat for endangered species like rhino, 25 to 50% of which are now under private ownership. When a cattle ranch is converted to a game ranch, it's not overgrazed anymore, and the land begins to restore itself through normal ecological succession, greater species richness, greater species diversity. And so what we have here is an ad hoc ecological restoration project on a massive scale that happened as an unintended consequence of a change in law devolving ownership of wildlife to landholders. And so, when the land is restored, it begins to provide ecosystem services, which the evaluation of ecosystem services is in its infancy, and the numbers vary widely. But if you look at the CBNRM areas of Namibia and the game ranches of South Africa, and you give them an ecosystem valuation of $1,000, that was T-Web's calculation, annual benefits, it's about $35 billion per annum. That was updated just this year in a report by Gluck, Ecosystem Services Science, Policy, and Practice, at $2,871 per hectare per year of grassland and ecosystem services. That comes out to $100 billion a year that is being provided to the global community by those two areas. And it hasn't cost the peoples of those countries a penny. It's all been paid for by tourism, one form or another. Take a quick look at Botswana. Botswana has initiated a ban on hunting. Ian Khama is against hunting, the president of Botswana. What impact that will have, I don't know. That's what Kenya did in 1967. That's what Botswana is doing now. However, the CBNRM income to Botswana has also been extraordinary. That went from zero in 1995 to almost 35 million pula. Pula is, how many pula to $1? I think it's about 5 now. So it's still a significant income, and that went to the rural indigenous peoples of Botswana. 73% from hunting safaris, 19% from photo safaris. That's data from the World Conservation Union. So there's some controversy about how much money actually reaches the local people. And that's something that it seems gets worked out over time. Namibia seems to have solved that problem. Botswana seems to be struggling with it. Going on out of Botswana, Zimbabwe here. As it turns out, hunters are less risk averse and are still willing to go to places like Zimbabwe. And so something like 98% or more of the revenues to these villages comes from hunting. They've made several attempts to introduce photographic tourism. People just don't want to take the risk. It's just too dangerous. They've also made a lot of attempts to broaden the use of available resources into forestry and other veldt products, herbs and things like that, and that hasn't generated much money. So they're really almost 100% dependent upon revenue from hunting in Zimbabwe. But it also had an effect on private ownership. This is the Save Valley Conservancy, which is 3,400 square kilometers, almost as big as Gonorrhea Zoo National Park. It was 26 ranches. They removed all the cattle, took down all the fences, reintroduced the wildlife, and they run both photo and hunting safaris, but it's almost entirely hunting safaris. They have critically endangered wild dog. They have the largest population of critically endangered black rhino in the world, and they are involved in community development. 1/3 of the Save Valley Conservancy was expropriated by Mugabe. One of the other things about the rhino is that as they're dispersed across private ownership, they're harder for the poachers to find. The poachers know they're in Kruger. They can go into Kruger and find rhino. The rest of them are all spread out through the country, so that somewhat ensures their survival. But this is the slide I really wanted to get to. These were two models that were done by completely different studies. And they show the campfire model in Zimbabwe at the state at the top, in the upper left here. This is regulation of campfire. It's essentially part of what you were asking about. The state regulates from the top, the rural district councils, the people, and of course the wildlife, in self-regulating their own populations, provide the basis. The CBNRM model done by WHO in 2007 there's a lot of international donor support at the top, the national organizations, and then the local communities. But the power is vested now in the local communities. You could put beneath that the wildlife and the land, and when you do that, you're really replicating, in a sense, a trophic pyramid. And that's really what keeps ecosystems in balance, is regulation balanced between top-down and bottom-up forces. And by devolving ownership to the local people, you put the regulation in balance.